In this video, I'll be talking about writing good stories. So to create good stories, we generally focus on 6 attributes. So good story is independent, it is negotiable, it is valuable to the users or the customers or the purchasers, it is estimatable, it is small in size, and it is testable. These are always referred as invest guidelines for the good stories. So first is independent. As much as possible, care should be taken to avoid introducing dependencies between the stories. So dependencies between stories lead to prioritization and planning problems. For example, suppose the customer has selected as high priority for a story that is dependent on a story which is with low priority. Dependencies between stories can also make estimation much harder than it needs to be. The second property of a good story is it has to be negotiable. Stories are negotiable. They are not not kind of written contracts. These are not obligations or requirements that the software must implement. Story cards are short descriptions of functionality, the details of which are to be negotiated in a conversation between the customer and the development team. Because story cards are reminders to have a conversation rather than fully detailed requirements themselves. They do not need to include all relevant details. However, if at the time the story is written, some important details, if they are known, they should be included as annotations on the story card. Now the third property is, so the story has to be valuable to the purchaser or the users. Now each story must be valued by the users. But many projects include stories that are not valued by only users but by the purchasers also. Keeping in mind the distinction between the user, someone who uses the software, and the purchaser, someone who purchases the software. So the purchaser may be different and the user of the system may be different. Suppose a development team is building a software that will be deployed across a large user base in the company, perhaps maybe 5,000 computers in a single company. The purchaser of a product like that may be very concerned that each of the 5,000 computers is using the same configuration for the software. This may lead to a story like all configuration information is read from a central location. Now the users may not care where the configuration information is stored, but the purchaser have to take care of this. The next property is the stories has to be estimatable. Now it is important for developers to be able to estimate or at least take a guess at the size of a story or the amount of time it will take to turn a story into a working code. There are 3 common reasons why a story may not be estimatable. The first reason is the developer lacks domain knowledge, or the developer lack technical knowledge, or the story is too big. In case of first reason, the developer may have some less domain knowledge. Now, if developer do not understand a story as it is written, they should discuss it with the customer who wrote the story. Again, it's not necessary to understand all the details about a story, but the developers need to have a general understanding of the story. The second one was the story may not be estimatable because the developer do not understand the technical details or technology involved. So maybe the developer is aware of certain specific language or framework, and user is expecting the solution in say Python. So developer need to understand the technology in which the solution has to be designed. And finally, the developers may not be able to estimate a story because it is too big. So the story has to be small in size. The next important property of a good story is the story has to be small. Yes, that is what we have discussed in the previous point. Some stories can be too big and some can be very small and some can be just right. Story size does matter, because if stories are too large or too small, you cannot use them in planning. Epics are difficult to work with because they frequently contain multiple stories. For example, in a travel reservation system, a user can plan a vacation. This will be an epic. Planning a vacation is important functionality for a travel reservation system, but there are many tasks involved in doing so. The epic should be split into smaller stories. The ultimate determination of whether a story is appropriately sized is based on the team, its capabilities, and the technologies which are in use. The last good property or last property of a good story is the story should be testable. Stories must be written so as to be testable. So successfully passing its tests proves that a story has been successfully developed. If the story cannot be tested, how can the developers know when they have finished the coding? Untestable stories commonly show up for non-functional requirements, which are requirements about the software, but not directly about its functionality. So these are the invest guidelines for good stories. So to summarize, ideally stories are independent from one another. This is not always possible, but to the extent stories should be written so that they can be developed in any order. The details of a story are negotiated between the user and the developers. Stories should be written so that their values to users and customers is clear. Stories may be annotated with details, but too much details may create some problems with story writing process. One of the best way to annotate a story is to write test case of the story. And if there are too big compound and complex stories, then you may split them into multiple smaller stories. If they are too small, multiple tiny stories may be combined together, making it a bigger story. And the last one is stories need to be testable. So these are the invest guidelines for good user stories.